right, good morning. You have to bear with me a little bit this morning. I do have, as Jack was talking about, a little bit of a cough here or whatever. Like he's got a little bit of that. My wife's got a little bit of that. It seems like it's that time of year. Every year I kind of come down with something. A lot of times it's this little nagging cough that just won't go away. Anybody ever deal with that? Like you have it for months and it's just like it just sticks around. Well, I'm kind of in the middle of that right now. So feeling good other than that, but you might have to bear with me a little bit this morning as I'm hopefully a little bit of water and maybe the cough drop I just had might help out a little bit, but we'll see. So this morning we're actually going to start a new series. And for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at a story, and we're going to be looking at the story of Ruth. And so if you have your Bibles and you want to turn to the book of Ruth, we're going to be starting there this morning. And this story is full of, romance and drama, and it's got a fair bit of tension in it and things. And so we're going to be looking at this story over the next 4 weeks. And it's one of those things where, how when you're watching a TV show, and every week you're watching the show, and at the end of the show, you're like, okay, what happens next, right? And then you got to wait a whole week to find out what's next. Well, that's kind of what this is going to be like for the next couple of weeks here is as we start talking about this story at the end of each week, possibly, you might be a little bit like, okay, well, we're not done yet, right? Well, no, we're not done because we're going to finish it the following week. And so we're going to be talking about that a little bit this morning. And here's what I want to do this morning. What we really want to do is we want to really zoom in this week and look at the characters in this story and look at their lives and things. And I think if we do that, I really think if we zoom in and we're honest with ourselves as we're looking at this story and we're looking at the people that are involved in it, I think we might find a little bit of ourselves in this story. We might find ourselves in here. And so we're going to look at this. And then what we need to do is then zoom back out and look at the bigger picture, of God and the story. In the story and how God is present throughout this entire book and his heart and his mind in this fascinating book. And so that's where we're going to be at this morning. So here's what we need to know. Ruth is a story for people who have lost hope. Right? It's really a story for people who have lost hope. It's a story for people who have faced hard times. Right? They can relate to this story. And so it's for people that have faced hard times. And Ruth is a story for people who wonder if their ordinary lives really matter in the grand scheme of things, right? Like that's what it is. And the story is about, what we need to remember is this story is about real people and it's about a real God, right? That's what this story is about. And so as we look at it, we need to keep that in mind. These are real people, and it's about a real God. And so chapter 1 is really about real life and real problems in life and what happens and how people respond when life turns really bad. That's what we're going to look at in chapter 1. Okay? So as we're looking at this, remember, I want us to try to find ourselves in this story a little bit as we begin to read. And so chapter 1 opens up this way. Nope. Clicker is not working. So, all right. So, we'll see. Oh, here we go. Chapter 1 starts, in the days when the judges ruled. And so we read this and it says, in the days when the judges ruled, and what does that mean, right? What does that tell us? And this refers to that 400-year period, actually, after Israel entered the land that God had promised them. It was roughly 1500 BC to like 100 BC. And it was a very dark time in Israel's history. Okay? It was a really dark time in Israel's history. And if you take and you look actually back in your Bibles, you might just turn back a page or two, whatever, and you get to the very end of the book right before this, and the very last verse of that book in Judges, it says this. Oh, still not working. So it says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit, right? And so it's like this free-for-all, right? The culture there, it's like this free-for-all. In fact, there's one pastor by the name of Mark Driscoll. He actually said this. He put it this way. He said it's like a prison riot plus spring break meets Mardi Gras, which equals Hebrews gone wild, which is what the culture was like, okay, at that time. I mean, that's really what it was. It was just they did what they saw fit in their own eyes. And that's the culture, and that's the what's going on as we begin the book of Ruth. And that's what we're looking at this morning. And so the next slide. It says this. It says, there was famine in the land, as verse 1 continues, right? Famine in the land. Well, what land is that? What land is it that there was famine in? Well, the land was Bethlehem. You've heard that name before, right? You know where that is. We talk about that, especially at Christmas and things like that. We talk about Bethlehem, right? And we know what that means. Well, the name of Bethlehem actually is house of bread. It's really what it means. And so, but here's the thing: there's no bread in the house of bread. There's no food in the place where there should be food, right? That's kind of an ironic name for it in the middle of this famine that's going on. And here's the thing: this is a consequence of every man doing what it is that they saw fit. That's what it is. It's the consequence of that, and they're doing what seems right in their own eyes. And it's a loving discipline of God who cares and is concerned for those people, right? Men who do what is right in their own eyes. He still loves and cares for these people, and this is his loving discipline on these people. And in Ruth 1 through 2, next slide, it says this. It says, what's that? Yeah, I am. Oh, there it goes. Now it did. I tried it a second ago. All right, here we go. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites, from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab to live there. And so they went there to this country of Moab. And Moab was about 30 to 50 miles or so southeast of Bethlehem. And this area of Moab had some interesting beginnings. The people of Moab had an interesting beginning because Lot and his daughters, if you know the story of Lot and his daughters escaped Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Lot and his daughters escaped Sodom and Gomorrah. The mom didn't make it because she disobeyed God, and she turned around and looked, and she turned into a pillar of salt. But Lot and his daughters, they escaped Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what happens then is after they leave, the daughters and stuff, they believe that they're like the only ones left on earth. They believe that the world has pretty much come to an end and that they're the only survivors. And so they do something that's not good. And what they end up doing is they end up getting their dad drunk, and they sleep with their dad, and he impregnates them. And so the Moabite people began with the sons of one of Lot's daughters. We can read about that in Genesis chapter 19. And so the people of Moab were a sexually promiscuous people who worshiped a god, Chemosh, and they sacrificed their children to that god. It sounds like a wonderful place, right? Sounds like a great place to live. And God explicitly told his people not to live there and to intermarry with these people, and yet look at what happens in this story. We're going to look and see, because that's exactly what they end up doing. And this famine in the land is so dire and times are so hard that it will change this entire family. Elimelech, which his name actually means God is my king. Okay, remember that. His name means God is my king. Takes his wife, whose name is Naomi, and her name means pleasant and sweet. Okay, and their 2 sons, whose names were Mahlon and Chilion, whose names mean death and sickness. Not sure why you name your kids that, but that's what it meant, death and sickness. And they went to Moab, this forbidden place, right? This forbidden place, and they went to live there. That's what they did. And here's the first real response that we get to see in this to life when it gets hard and when times seem lost and hope seems lost and situations are getting really bad. This is our first response, is this: I can choose to compromise. When this happens, we can choose to compromise. And then we see here Elimelech responded to this famine in this dire situation in Bethlehem by running into compromise. That's what he did. He ran into compromise. He decided to ignore what he knew God said and do what seemed right to him at the time. Sounds like the culture that he lived in, right? right? The culture that at that time, the time of the judges and stuff, it was they did as they saw fit in their own eyes, right? That's what they did. And so here's Elimelech. He's facing this famine, and he's trying to figure out, like, what are we going to do? And he decides, you know what? I know God's told us we're not supposed to go there. We're not supposed to live there and do that, but I'm going to go there, and I'm going to live there anyway. And so he runs into compromise. And so Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. Right? When we follow our own conscience, when we just do what we feel is right, and we ignore what God has told us, it leads to death. Right? It's not a good situation when that happens. And Elimelech decided to do what seemed right to him instead of what he knew was right, which is ironic because Elimelech's name, remember what it was? God is my king. Right? That was his name. God is my king, but yet he's not doing what God has called him to do, and yet he decides to do what seems right in his own eyes and to be his own king, really. That's really what he was deciding to do, is to be his own king. And hard times become an excuse for him to compromise. Hard times become an excuse for him to compromise. He paid lip service to God, right? But he didn't surrender his life to him, right? He would say, God is my king, right? My name, God is king, right? He is my king. But then he goes and he does exactly the opposite of what God's told him to do. He's paying lip service to God. He's saying, I follow God, right? But yet, I'm going to go and do my own thing. And here's the implications for us today is that compromise is lip service. It's not life surrender. Right? Compromise is lip service. It's not life surrender. Listen, it's easier to say that we simply trust in God, right? To just simply say, oh, I trust in God, than it is to actually allow him to be the ruler and commander of our lives. It's a lot easier sometimes, isn't it? To just say, yeah, I trust in God, but then when the rubber meets the road, sometimes that gets hard. When you're actually asked to follow, and then it's like, okay, what am I going to do here, right? It's easier to say God is king in my life than it is to allow him to sit on the throne of my heart. It's just easier at times. Compromise says, I trust God, but I'm going to do my own thing. Right? That's what compromise says. It's like this. You would say, I know what God says about sex, but we love each other. In our culture today, especially young people, in the way that they're raised and things like that, this is a common type stuff. I know what God says about sex, but we love each other. It's amazing to me to think about how many people that think it's weird to get married and not have lived together first. And that's just not a new thing. That was when my wife and I got married. Like it was, some of her friends even were like, "Well, you're not going to live together first?" Well, no. No, that's not how that works, But to the culture, that seems right? You live with the person to see if you can get along with them and all this kind of stuff, but that's not what God calls us to do. And so we compromise. There are Christian people who are believers in God, call themselves Christians, and they compromise in these areas. They allow themselves to compromise. Or we say, I know what God says about his church, but I have some other things to do. Right? I got other things in my life that are more important to me than his church. Or I know what God says about not forsaking getting together, but it's just easier to just watch online and not show up, because I just don't feel like being there today. Right? Let's be honest. It's easier sometimes to do that. Sometimes we feel like it's just easier to just do this or that. I just don't feel like going today, so I'm just going to stay home. Well, God says that we're not supposed to forsake the getting together, right? The assembling of the body. I know what God says about leading my family and being the spiritual leader in my home, but my wife's just better at it, so I let her do it. Right? It's compromise. It's compromise. Compromise is ultimately a rejection of the relationship with God, right? Versus simply a rebellion against the rules of God. It's a rejection of the relationship that we have with him versus actually just the rules that he has, right? That's not really what it is. It's not just that I'm not following his rules. I'm rejecting the relationship that I have with him. I'm supposed to be in a relationship with him, and when I do these things and when I compromise, I'm rejecting that relationship and I'm choosing to do my own thing, in my own time, my own way. It's compromise. Ruth, starting in verse 3, says this. It says, now Elimelech, Noah's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women and named them Orpah and the other Ruth. Okay, so here we have Noah, we have Elimelech's family, right? And he passes away, and Naomi's there, and she's with her two daughter-in-laws now, her two daughters, and it says that Elimelech's compromise it was catchy, right? That's what it's telling us, is Elimelech's compromise was catchy. His daughters are now compromising, right? Because they're what it says is that when they named them this, it was contagious. He leads, his daughters, his boys, I said his daughters, but his boys are compromising, right? His boys are compromising. They marry Moabite women. What were they not to do? They were not to intermarry with Moabite people. But Elimelech compromised and said, I'm going to go to an area where I know I'm not supposed to live because God's told me I'm not supposed to be there. And not only that, but now I'm going to raise my boys there and stuff, and now he's gone, he died, he passed away, and they're kind of following their dad's footsteps. It's okay to be here, right? God's told us we're not supposed to marry into this or whatever, we're supposed to marry Moabite people, but we're going to do it anyway. And so they compromise. Compromise is catchy. He led his family into this forbidden land. His sons marry forbidden women. Providing for the physical well-being of his family it was important to him, but not necessarily the spiritual. He didn't put the spiritual part up where it should have been, probably, to teach his family in the way that they should go, right? To raise his children in that way. The boys simply were thinking about the physical. These gals were good looking, right? Whatever. But not the spiritual. They weren't concerned about the spiritual ramifications of this union between them and their wives. They weren't concerned about it. Dad was not willing to do the right thing, even if it was the harder thing to do, right? And that's probably why. It was harder to stay where it was in the famine, so he chose to just move on and go somewhere else. Dad wasn't willing to do that. The boys resorted to the easier thing instead of deciding to do the right thing, which was probably harder again, right? So the boys decided to do that. They're like, you know what, we're surrounded by Moabite women. Like, what are we supposed to do? God says we're not supposed to, but look at where we're at. Guess we're just going to do it, right? It's compromise. Bethlehem was a mere 30 to 40, 50 miles away, right? And so they could have easily just walked back to Bethlehem, right? But it was easier to just compromise. And so compromise is contagious. Compromise is contagious. Elimelech's compromise impacted his whole family. It impacted his whole family. Elimelech compromised, and his boys followed suit. His compromise was catchy. And here's the thing. For young people out there today, they need to think about this, right? Teens think it's easier if your friends are doing something, right? It's easier to just go along with it, the whole peer pressure thing, right? That it's a lot easier to just do that, and you're like, oh, my friends are all doing it, so I might as well too, right? It's how it is, and especially in our culture. I mean, I was a youth pastor for a long time, and I know how that goes. A lot of times, the way somebody's friend group goes is the way that person will go. And somebody who maybe was very involved in church growing up and stuff ends up getting in with a little bit of the wrong crowd and stuff, and now all of a sudden they're not coming to youth group, they're not doing this type of stuff, and they're starting to go off with them, and now they're doing stuff that they know is wrong, they know they shouldn't be doing, but they're compromising because their friends are compromising, because they're in that group and they're drawn into it. And then what happens with that is then other teens maybe see that and go, oh, it's okay to go and do that thing, right? It's okay to be like that. I see this person who I thought was, they call themselves a Christian, and they're doing this, so I guess it's okay or they will go, I'm not as bad as them. I'm doing this and that, right? And they start comparing themselves, but compromise is catchy, right? It's contagious. And dads and husbands, right? Our compromise affects our whole family. Our compromise affects our whole family. Dads are called to be the primary spiritual leader in their home, right? And so to your children, to your wife, right? And the stats bear out the fact that how the dad goes, so the family goes, right? If the dad's compromising, the family's probably going to compromise. And the dad's like, well, I provide for my family financially, right? The church stuff I leave to my wife. There's a lot of dads out there that do that. I don't really like going to church. I don't really want to go to church, but my wife, she enjoys it, so I guess I'll go. And the kids know that. The kids hear him say it, right? I don't really want to go. And the wife's like, oh, but come on, we should be there. Okay, fine, I guess we'll go, right? Not a great example for your children, right? When you're doing that, it's compromise, right? It's I call myself a Christian, but I just don't feel like doing the things I'm supposed to be doing. And so the dads, I would have to say, like, even for myself, like, when's the last time you had a conversation with your children about God? When's the last time you just sat down with them and talked to them in that way? When's the last time that you got involved in their life in a real meaningful way? And when's the last time that you prayed with them, or how involved are you with them when they're dating and that kind of stuff, right? Like, that's the things I have to think about, and that's what the things that dads need to think about. How involved are you in your kids' lives? And are you being the spiritual leader that we're called to be? Husbands are called to lead in their marriage, right? Just like Jesus does the church. We're called to lead in our marriage. We're called to do that and be that spiritual leader. It's not up to the wife. It's not one of those things where, you know what, hey, I provide financially, I go out and I work, but the church stuff, I just leave it to my wife. That's not okay. That's not how God has designed us. It's not how he designed relationship and marriage. He has specific roles for us, and that's not it. Ruth 4:5 says this: after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So her husband and both of her sons are now gone. And look at how this goes, right? Elimelech, he paid lip service to God, right? But he did not surrender his life to God. And he ran into compromise, and he led his boys in the same place, and he ran there to find life, but look what happens. His family name dies in Moab. His family name dies in Moab. His wife and daughters-in-law are left vulnerable and unprotected because of where he took them, because of the choices that he made, because of the compromise that he made. They died. They die, and their widows are left alone, away from the place of God and without the people of God. They have no community there of the people of God. They're away from all of that. And here's the thing. Compromise leaves us vulnerable. Compromise leaves people vulnerable. It really does. When we compromise, it will leave other people vulnerable. It begs the question, who am I leaving vulnerable because of my compromise? When I'm compromising in my life, and when I'm making excuses for my actions, and I'm deciding to not do what I know God's calling me to do, who else is that affecting in my life, and how is it leaving them vulnerable? How is it leaving them vulnerable to Satan's attacks, right? Because they don't see the example in me that they should be seeing, and so now they're being left vulnerable. And so compromise leaves us vulnerable. And then verses 6 through 7, it says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she said to her daughters-in-law, prepare to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. All right, so Naomi hears how God is providing for his people back where they used to live, right, in their homeland. And so she and her daughters-in-law, they prepare for this 40 to 50 mile journey back to Bethlehem. And so they're getting ready for that. And you've got these 3 widows that are looking for food, looking for fortune, and looking for a future. That's really what they're doing. And then look what Naomi says. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you and your people. But here's the thing, so they refuse at first. They're like, no, we're going to go with you and to be with your people, right? But then, read what it says. It says, but Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Naomi and her daughters have headed back to Bethlehem, and Naomi is trying to convince them to go back home. She's trying to convince them that, hey, it'd be better for you to just go back to Moab. Just go back there. I'm going to go on to Bethlehem. I don't see any hope for me. I've lost all hope, but you guys should go back. And it says, even it says that they should go back and that maybe they can find peace in the home of another husband, right? And so she's telling them to go back. And then let's continue reading. It says, verses 14 through 20 say this. At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Do you hear what I just said? She said, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Then Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? And then read verse 20, what it says. Don't call me Naomi, she told them, but call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Look at what happens to Naomi. Look at what happens to Naomi. Life got hard, and she went from being Naomi, pleasant and sweet. That's the name, pleasant and sweet. Pleasant, sweet, and beautiful. To Mara, which means bitter. It means bitter. It's what a picture of what can happen to people when life gets hard. When life gets hard, they can become bitter, right? When life gets hard for me, sometimes I can become bitter. Right? I can choose to compromise. I can also become bitter. I can become very bitter at times when life isn't going my way. And Naomi had lost all hope. Life became bitter for me, and God has it out for me. That's what she's saying, right? Life has become bitter for me, and God has it out for me. And look at what happens because she is bitter. She begins to blame God for her present circumstances, right? She's like, it's God's fault. It's your fault, God. He's turned against me. He's no longer for me, and so therefore I'm bitter and I'm walking away. And here's the thing: bitterness tends to shift blame. Bitterness tends to shift blame, right? When we become bitter and stuff, we begin to blame other people for that, and we begin to do that. It's another way that we choose to do that, and we say, you know what, I'm bitter, but it's not my fault, it's their fault. It's because of this, it's because of that, and we shift all this blame, and we don't look at our own life and our own circumstances. But that's not all. She repels instead of invites. She begins to repel instead of invite. Right? The only believer Ruth and Orpah know is trying to turn them away from God. She told him, it'd be better if you just go back to there, maybe get a husband there, and go back to their gods, right? That's what she said. Your sister-in-law is going back to her gods. You should go with her. So the only believer that Ruth and Orpah really know at this point is trying to turn them away from God. To go back home is to return to the gods of their people and their pagan ways. Naomi trying to convince them of that is crazy, right? She's like trying to convince them to go back to that. And you get the circumstances, but she had lost all hope. She had lost all hope. She had lost all hope, and she began to do what others of us do when life turns rough, right? We begin to repel instead of attract, right? We begin to get bitter, and this bitterness turns into something that's not so nice, right? This bitterness repels instead of attracts. That's what it does. Bitterness repels instead of beauty became bitter. Sweetness became sour. And pleasant became pessimistic. When you think of her name change there, right, and what she wanted to be called, and the difference, she had gone from those things to those things, and she's now not somebody, you don't look at that and go, that's something I'm attracted to, right? The idea of bitter, sour, pessimistic, those aren't good qualities, right? The first name, right, beauty, sweetness, and pleasant, that's attractive. The others repel. Right, you try to eat something and you're like, oh, this looks really good. You take a big bite of it and it's sour. Ooh, spit it out, right? Like, I remember one morning I got up and I got my coffee, and I pretty much drink coffee just about every morning, and I got up and I didn't notice until after I had poured my milk into my coffee that the milk was a little chunky. I wasn't paying attention. I just poured a little bit of milk in there. I set it aside. I started taking a little sip, and I'm like, that does not taste right. What is wrong? I looked down, I saw these little tiny chunks floating in there, and I'm like, what is that from? And I look at the milk, and I'm like, oh man, that milk is chunky. Like, that is not okay. Like, that'll make you want to get that stuff out real quick, right? It repels instead of attracts. I was not attracted to that coffee this morning, right? Normally, I make my coffee, and I smell it, and I'm like, oh, that smells so good. Like, it's starting to wake me up in the morning. I take my drink, and I'm like, oh, that tastes amazing. I want some more, right? That's how it works. I was repelled by that coffee that morning. I was like, this is awful. I don't want to be anywhere near this coffee. I'm going to throw that out. I'm going to throw the jug of milk away. I'm going to rinse the jug out and then put it back into the trash can because I don't want the smell in the whole house because it's that nasty, right? That's how it is, right? Bitterness repels instead of attracts. When we become bitter, we start to repel people. Verse 21 says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Naomi, in her bitterness, can only think of all that she's lost. That's all she can think about. But there's something that's really interesting to me here, right? When you read this, and she's like, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. It's a pretty strong statement, right? Who's with her as she's walking back to Bethlehem? Ruth. When Ruth hears this, what do you think she thinks? Also, I'm nothing now. Right? I think it's interesting. She's like, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought forth misery upon me, right? Like, she's like, I've got nothing. And there's Ruth standing right beside her. I wonder how Ruth felt. Naomi could not or would not even see that she had what she had in this loyal daughter-in-law. She just didn't see it. The implications for us today is this. It's, bitterness gripes instead of being grateful. Bitterness gripes instead of being grateful, right? It repels instead of attracts, but it also gripes instead of being grateful. Elimelech chose compromise. Naomi became bitter, right? And as she's getting bitter, she's complaining. She doesn't see the things that she's been blessed with. She doesn't see any of that. All she can focus on is the stuff that she's lost. She's become bitter, and she begins griping and complaining about her life and the way things are. 14 through 16 says, but Ruth clung to her. Right? Remember what it says? Remember what it said? But Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. And then she says something incredible. Ruth says something incredible, and some of you have had this read at your wedding and things like that or whatever. People have this read at weddings and things and stuff. But we need to remember the context of what this is talking about, right? This context is king, right? Context is everything, and the context of this is a Moabite daughter-in-law to her Israeli mother-in-law after they have lost everything. right? That's the context of this. And it says this, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So Ruth says this, and I think it's a pretty good description of Ruth's conversion. It's a pretty good description of Ruth's conversion, right? She's saying yes to God. And in this, if you read, it says, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates us. She's understanding that, I believe in your God. I'm following you, and I'm believing in your God, and I'm believing in hope, and I believe in a future for us. And even if it's in death, we're going to still be together because we both believe in the same God. And I'm following after you, and I'm saying, I believe in your God. This is evidence of her conversion. I think it's interesting. I think it's fascinating in light of the fact that her primary evangelists have been a compromising Christian and a bitter believer. Think about it. The examples that she had, right? Her dad and her mom, compromising Christian, her father-in-law and mother-in-law, a compromising Christian and a bitter believer. Those are the examples that she had. But she still has faith, and she's going, I'm coming with you. I believe in you, and I believe in your God. Here's the thing. I can choose to compromise, or I can choose to become bitter, or I can cling to hope, right? I can cling to hope. That's the other option that we have. When life gets hard and things get tough, I can cling to hope. In the middle of a hard life, Ruth is clinging to hope, right? She's clinging to hope. In the middle of this tragic life, she's clinging to hope, right? This is not a great situation for them, but she's clinging to hope, and she's clinging to Naomi and saying, I'm clinging to you and your God, and I'm following you. And Ruth decides to cling to and follow a God she could not see and did not always understand, into a future she could not predict. That's what she chooses to do. And here's the thing. when we do this, I think there's lots of times that we think about this, like this God, right, that we serve, we can't necessarily see him, and sometimes we don't fully understand him. And so that can make it easy sometimes to go and compromise. It can make it easy sometimes to get bitter when life's not going right. It can make it easy sometimes to blame shift, right? And to say, well, things aren't going so well, and I blame God because he's in control, right? And so therefore, if he's in control, then it must be his fault. Well, that's not the case, right? But it gets easy to do that. And here's Ruth that she's clinging to this God, right? To follow a God that she cannot see, that she doesn't always understand, into a future that she cannot predict. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. When you think about where she came from, where she grew up, the people that were her examples, she's something special, right? It's pretty amazing to think about this. Here's the thing. Hope connects the people of God, right? Hope connects to the people of God. It connects us to the people of God, right? Ruth knew she needed to be in a community of hope. Right? She knew that she needed to be in that community of hope. Even when we don't feel like it at times, we need to connect to the people of God. Even if we're not feeling it, right? That's why we come together. That's why we do this. That's why we celebrate different things, and we have different times we get together, whether it's here or small groups or whatever. We do those things because we're connecting to the people of God, and hope connects us to the people of God. And that's why I worry most about the people that don't go to church, they miss all the time. Right? People that either just don't go to church, or they call themselves Christians, they call themselves believers, but they're rarely there. They're rarely part of the body. I have to wonder, what is that, right? Because the scripture says we're not supposed to forsake the assembling of the believers, right? But then if we're going to go and we're going to do that, that's a compromise, right? It's like, well, I got better things to do. Sunday mornings are kind of hard for me because it's the only day that I really don't have to get up early or whatever. I can just stay home and relax. And there's also the football game on at 1:00, and I don't like to miss the kickoff. And and by the time we get done with church and the pastor stops talking, it's the game's already started sometimes. And so we can come up with all kinds of excuses and all kinds of things for why we compromise, but we do it. We compromise. And I worry the most for a lot of people that you see them maybe once a month or less at times, and it's like what's going on in their life? Like what are they going through right now, and are they compromising in different ways? Are they bitter maybe? Are they whatever? But they need to be connected to the people of God, right? Because hope connects us to the people of God. Life can get bitter and lonely, and we need to connect to the people of God, right? Because if we're not connected to them, life can become very bitter and lonely when we're not doing that. And compromise becomes an easier part for that part of that community, right? Compromise becomes easier when we're away from this community. We're now part of some other community, right? That's not doing what God's asking us to do. Compromise becomes much easier when we're away from the body. When we're not here, when we're not fellowshipping with one another, when we're not rubbing shoulders with one another and iron sharpening iron, right? When we're not doing those things and we're just always off somewhere else, it can become a problem, and it makes it much easier to compromise. Hope also acknowledges the presence of God, right? Hope acknowledges the presence of God. Even when I cannot see and I don't always understand, I know that He's there. Even when I can't always see it and I don't fully understand it, I know that He's there, right? That hope that I have in Him, it acknowledges His presence. It's interesting that the book of Ruth, there are no miracles. Did you realize that? There's no miracles in the book of Ruth. There's none. And many of us would say that if God would just show me a miracle, right, I would believe and be more committed. If God would just speak to me audibly. But you notice in the book of Ruth, she gets no miracles. She gets no audible word from God, right? And I fall into that at times, right? I think, man, boy, it'd be really neat to live back then in biblical times, whatever, when you read these things about these guys and they have this audible voice that speaks to them, and they hear the actual voice of God, and it's like, man, if I had that, committed I would be. Like, man, if we would just do that, I would be like, I'm all in, man. There ain't nothing going to stop me, right? But then you look at some of the examples and you go, man, those guys had an audible voice from God. They saw miracles. They still didn't always follow, right? But hope, it acknowledges the presence of God, even when I can't understand what's going on, even when I don't see what what He's doing exactly. And Ruth, she follows Him anyway, and she trusts that He's working in ways that she can't see and that she can't fully understand. Even though she has no miracles, she has no audible voice of God, she's still trusting that He's working in certain ways in her life. She didn't only acknowledge the presence of God, but she surrendered to the plan of God. She surrendered to the plan of God. Here's the thing. Hope places our life in the hands of God, right? Hope places our life in the hands of God, right? Think about Ruth's life for a minute. She's married to a man whose name means sickness or death, right? It's like, and so she's married to this guy, whatever. She watches her father-in-law, her brother-in-law, and her husband all die. She leaves everything she knows. She leaves her family, and she connects and she clings to a woman who is bitter, who's this bitter old woman. Right? She leaves everything she knows in Moab. That's where she grew up. That's all the people that she knows. She cleaves and she clings to this bitter old woman at this point. And here's the thing. Ruth knew that it was better to be away from home with God than to be at home without God. She knew that it was better to be away from home with God than it was to be at home without God. She knew that there was something better there, that because God is there, because I'm going to be around that community, I'm going to be with those people, and I want to follow their God. I don't want to be back here and be influenced with all the stuff that they have, and all the stuff that just leads to death and disease and sickness. Like, I don't want that. I want what God has for me, and I'm willing to go and I'm willing to do that. We have no indication that she had any reason to believe that she would ever remarry. But Ruth knew that it was better to be single with God than it was to get married without God. She knew that it'd be better to be single with God than it would be to be married without God. She could have went back, like Ruth, like Naomi said, she could have went back to Moab, and she could have stayed there and tried to remarry somebody else, but it would have been somebody from that religion, probably from the Moabites, and somebody that didn't follow that God, and so she would be without God. She would be in a godless marriage. And she's like, I don't want that for me. It's not okay. If I'm going to remarry, it needs to be with somebody who is a godly person, right? Somebody who follows the God that I now follow. But we have no idea. Like, there was no inclination that she would ever get remarried, but she knew that it would be better to be single with God than to go back and get married without God. And that's something for, I think, young people in our world that they need to hear today, right? There are people in our church, there are people in our community, and the people around us, the young people, I think they need to hear this, right? It'd be so much better to be single than it is to be married to someone who's not a believer. Right? Then it'd be so much better to be single than to compromise and be like, you know what? I know God tells me I'm not supposed to really do that, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to marry somebody who's not a believer because, well, they make me happy in other ways. And maybe I can convert them eventually, right? Maybe eventually they'll come around. It's not good, right? But it happens so much in our world and in our culture that I think it is something that young people really need to think about today. It's better to be single than to be in a relationship that does not put God first. It's better to be single. And there's a lot of peer pressure for young people today, right? Kids in high school and stuff like that, they're all dating different people and all this kind of stuff. And there's all this peer pressure. Oh, you don't have somebody, you're not dating. Oh, what's wrong with you, right? That's kind of what they look at. It's like, well, there's nothing wrong with me. I haven't found the right person yet, and I'm probably not going to in high school. Maybe there are some times it happens, but most of the time it's like probably not going to find the right person in high school because I probably should be focused on other things because I'm still a child. I'm still developing. I'm still trying to figure out my life and everything else before I go and connect myself to somebody else, right? And they need to understand that it's better to be single than it is to be in a relationship without God. Like that's the truth of it. When we zoom in and we look at the people in this story, I think we can find ourselves in there somewhere probably. Probably a piece of us at least when we look at these different characters in here and when we look at how they reacted to a bad situation. We can see a little piece of us maybe in some of this, and I think this morning, if we're honest, we can find ourselves in this story this morning. And here's the question: are you living a life of compromise? Are you living a life of compromise? Are you giving lip service to God, saying, I'm going to do my own thing, I'm the king, right? Are you compromising in those ways? Like you're saying, God, okay, yes, I'm a believer, God's my king, but I'm going to go and do my own thing. I know what he says about this, but today I feel like not doing that. I want to do something else. Right? Are we compromising? Are we living in a life of compromise? And here's the thing we need to remember is this, that compromise is contagious. Compromise is contagious. When you do that, it's not just you that it's going to affect. When you begin to compromise in your life and you start doing things that you know God tells you you're not supposed to do, or you don't do the things that he tells you you're supposed to do, that's compromise, and that becomes contagious to the people around you. They see it, they know it, and eventually they can be affected by that too. Will you lead others in the way that they should go, or will you lead them into compromise? That's the question. Are you living a life of compromise? The second question is this: how many of us are stuck in the bitterness? How many of us are stuck in the bitterness this morning, right? It's, life's just not going my way. Things just aren't good in my life, and I just don't see any hope for me, for my future, and I'm becoming bitter, and I'm starting to blame shift. I'm blaming it on God, or I'm blaming it on this, or I'm blaming it on that. Things aren't just going the way I think they should be, and so it's that person's fault. And I think a lot of times when you do that, it's just, you just complain all the time because everyone else seems to be doing better than you. Or it's hard it's hard to be bitter and still look around and see how much you've been blessed. The old song, the count your blessings, name them one by one, right? How many of us do that on a regular basis? When we start feeling bitter and when we start feeling, down, and we're like, you know what, things just aren't going well, and I'm blaming this and that or whatever. How many of us count our blessings and reflect on that and go, you know what, God's been pretty good to me. Despite the fact that, there's these things going on, but you know what, I have this hope and trust in Jesus Christ, and because of that hope that I have in him, that connects me to the people of God, that acknowledges his presence, and that places my life in his hands. And because of that hope that I have, I know that my future is secure with him no matter what comes my way. And I know that I am blessed beyond comparison. Right? I have so much to be thankful for in my life when we really start to think about it. It's hard. It's hard to do that sometimes. And here's the thing. This ends, verse 22, it says, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And that's where chapter 1 leaves us. You've got Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth, who have made this excursion to this place where, Ruth doesn't really know probably what's going to happen. She doesn't really know a lot of, she might have heard a lot about it, but she's never really been there. And and so they're traveling there and they're getting there, and that's where it leaves us, is when they get there. And it's this bitter old woman, right, who thinks nothing is going right for her, who has no hope for herself anymore, with this woman who's clung to her and clung to her God, who's now going, you know what, I'm coming with you, and no matter what happens, I'm sticking with you, and I'm sticking with your God because I have faith and trust in him, and I believe he's going to do something, whatever it is. Even if it's when we die, we're going to be together because of him. That's hope. And that's where that leaves us this morning. And then next week, we'll for something good to begin, something bad has to end, right? For something good to begin in your life, something bad usually has to end. You have to get through that for something good to then happen. And so that's where it leaves us, and we're going to pick that up next week. So let's pray. Father, I thank you again for this opportunity for us to be here this morning, to be able to dig into your word a little bit, to look at this story of Naomi and Ruth and their travel and all of those things and where they're at mentally. Father, I pray that you would help each and every one of us to look at this story and think about the people in this story and the characters in this story, and where do we find ourselves? So we like some of them in some ways. Have we begun to compromise in our own lives in ways that we shouldn't? Have we begun to say, you know what, I follow God, but yet I know he wants me to do this, but I decided I'm going to do this instead? Have we done that in our own lives, or are we compromising in any of those ways? And Father, I pray that you would help us to think through that and think, what do we need to do to change that in our lives? And Father, are we bitter? Father, are any of us bitter here this morning? Or, as we're sitting here and thinking like, things just don't seem to be going well for me, and how am I handling that? How am I getting through that? And when I'm talking to others, do they see the bitterness? Do they see me as Naomi, or do they see me as Mara? Do they see me as somebody who's beautiful and sweet and kind, or do they see me as somebody who's bitter because of the way my circumstances are making me right now, Father? Or does your joy shine through me even in the bitterness? And Father, I pray that you would help each and every one of us to think that through, like how to count our blessings every single day, to not compromise, to not be bitter, And Father, I pray that you would just help us this morning to think about that and think about how we can cling to hope and cling to the hope that you've given us through your Son, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross for our sins. And because of that, we know that our future is secure and that we have hope and security in that. And that alone can give us joy. And these things I ask in your name. Amen.